April 1945. The war was collapsing in on itself, borders dissolving faster than maps could be redrawn. In southern Germany, at a small airfield already scarred by Allied strafing runs, a single Messerschmitt Bf 109 sat warming on the tarmac. Its engine coughed, then steadied, the sound sharp and metallic in the cold morning air. The pilot was 3-year-old Hans Keller, a Luftwaffe lieutenant whose war had begun with ceremony and confidence and was now ending in exhaustion and dread. His orders were brief, classified, and delivered without explanation. Reconnaissance over the Alps. Observe, report, return. He climbed into the cockpit knowing full well that many pilots no longer did. At 6:42, Hans Keller took off, lifting into a sky that looked deceptively calm. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. The Alps rose ahead like a wall, snowbound and indifferent, swallowing aircraft without leaving witnesses. Somewhere over those peaks, Hans made his final radio transmission. It wasn't a distress call. It wasn't even a message, just static, broken syllables, the sound of interference cutting through his voice until it vanished entirely. Ground control called back again and again. There was no response. No smoke on the horizon, no flare, no impact reported by civilians. In a war where planes fell daily, his disappearance barely registered. The Bf 109 never returned. No wreckage was found. No parachute. No body pulled from the mountains. The Alps kept their silence. Days turned into weeks, weeks into surrender. Germany fell. Files were abandoned. Records burned or lost. Hans Keller's name was typed onto a single line in a military ledger and stamped with the coldest designation the war had to offer. Missing in action. No grave. No answers. His family received a letter months later, carefully worded, offering condolences without certainty. He could be dead, he could be alive, he could be anywhere. In truth, he was nowhere anyone could reach. As Europe began the long process of rebuilding, Hans faded into the background noise of history. Millions were dead, millions more displaced. One missing pilot meant nothing against the scale of loss. His flight became a footnote, his absence absorbed into the chaos of war's end. The Alps stood unchanged, their peaks unmarked by memorials, their valleys hiding secrets beneath ice and stone. Whatever had happened to Hans Keller on that April morning, the mountains had taken it with them. For 80 years no one would know where he went, or why he never came back. Hans Keller's final mission was never fully explained, even to him. In the closing weeks of the war, the Luftwaffe was operating in fragments, issuing orders that bordered on desperation. Reconnaissance flights were still being flown, but not always for clear reasons. Allied forces were advancing rapidly, and command structures were breaking down. Hans had flown combat missions before, escorting bombers that no longer existed and defending airspace that was already lost. This flight was different. The route took him dangerously close to the high Alps, far from active fronts, far from friendly support. It raised questions even then. Reconnaissance of what, exactly, in territory that Germany no longer controlled? There were theories, whispered but never recorded, that pilots were being sent to assess potential escape corridors into neutral territory, that sensitive documents or intelligence were being moved before capture, that some flights were never meant to return at all. Hans's fuel load suggested a longer range than a simple patrol. His course pointed south, threading through mountain passes notorious for sudden storms and violent downdrafts. Flying there in April was a gamble even for experienced pilots. For someone ordered up with no explanation, it bordered on a sentence. Hans himself was no longer the eager cadet who had first put on the uniform. At 23, he was already a decorated pilot, but the war had stripped the shine from every medal. In his flight log, alongside headings and fuel calculations, his handwriting grew darker as the months passed. Early entries were precise, almost proud. Later ones wandered. He wrote about exhaustion, about cities burning below him, about orders that made no sense. One entry, written just days before his disappearance, stood out. "We fly, but nothing changes. Everything is ending, and they still send us up." Friends later said he had grown quiet, withdrawn, haunted by what he had seen. He spoke less about victory and more about survival. Whether his final flight was obedience, escape, or something else entirely remains unclear. No witness saw him go down. No report confirmed enemy contact. Somewhere over the Alps, Hans Keller simply vanished, carrying his unanswered questions with him. The war ended weeks later, but his story did not. It was suspended in midair, frozen at altitude, waiting for the mountains to give it back. The war ended as all wars do, loudly for some, silently for others. Germany surrendered. Cities lay in ruins. The world moved on. But in the small town of Bad Tolz, nestled between green foothills and quiet rivers, a letter arrived bearing no answers, only the bureaucratic echo of loss. Missing, presumed dead. That was all it said. No date, no location, no body. Hans Keller's parents sat at the kitchen table, holding the paper like it might change if they waited long enough. It didn't. His mother folded it once, carefully, and tucked it inside a drawer where it stayed for the rest of her life. There was no funeral, no grave to mark, only a photograph on the mantel, a black and white image of Hans in uniform, smiling faintly at a future that would never come. His siblings grew up, got married, had children. His name was spoken less each year. His absence, once sharp and unbearable, became background noise. The war had taken millions. Who would remember one missing pilot? The Luftwaffe never filed a detailed report. His mission records, like so many others, were lost in the chaos of retreat. Some documents were destroyed deliberately. Others simply vanished. The Alps, meanwhile, kept their secrets. Thousands of aircraft went down in those mountains during the war. Allied bombers, German fighters, transport planes carrying men and machines toward unknown destinations. Many have never been found. Crashes covered by avalanches, buried in glaciers, or scattered across slopes no one ever explored. In post-war Germany, there were no monuments for men like Hans Keller. Pilots were reminders of a war the country was trying to forget. Memorials were reserved for civilians, for victims. Soldiers disappeared not just in battle, but in memory. By the 1,972nd, even his surviving family struggled to recall the exact year he'd vanished. The Alps remained indifferent. Ice thickened. Trees grew taller. The place where Hans died, wherever it was, slipped out of living memory and into the cold permanence of stone. 80 winters passed. Each one pressed the wreckage deeper. Each spring, the sun failed to find it, until the ice began to melt. Summer 2025. High above the tree line near the Austrian-Italian border, two hikers pushed through thinning snowfields, their boots scraping against stone and ice. The terrain was brutal, steep, exposed, wind-scoured, but the air was unusually warm. A strange summer, the rangers had said. Glacial melt higher than ever recorded. Trails once buried under decades of snow were emerging like ghosts. The hikers weren't looking for history. They were chasing solitude. What they found instead was something else entirely. At first, it looked like debris from a weather balloon, a glint of twisted metal half sunken in a slope of pale ice. One of them brushed away a thin crust of frost with their glove. Rivets, a hinge. Not balloon wreckage, not new. Then, just barely visible through the fogged surface of a steel panel, a faded black cross. The Balkenkreuz. Luftwaffe. A chill passed through them that had nothing to do with altitude. They called it in. It took the Alpine authorities 2 days to reach the site. The elevation made landing a helicopter dangerous, so a mountain team approached on foot. As they chipped away at the surrounding ice, more emerged. A wing, part of a cockpit canopy. The side fuselage, crushed but unmistakably belonging to a Messerschmitt Bf 109, a model not seen in the sky since the 1940 seconds. Stenciled numbers on one panel, barely legible, matched archival records. The aircraft had been locked in the glacier for 8 decades, preserved in a cold tomb of shifting ice. But what they found inside changed everything. Still, strapped into the pilot's seat was a skeleton. Flight gear mummified by cold. Leather torn, bone exposed beneath a Luftwaffe flight jacket. A cracked oxygen mask hung loose at the jaw. The bones hadn't been scattered. He hadn't ejected. He died right there, frozen in place, surrounded by the wreckage of his final flight. The discovery stunned authorities and historians alike. A German pilot missing since 1945, found in perfect isolation, deep in one of the last untouched corners of the Alps. His dog tags were still around his neck. His name etched into thin, worn metal. Hans Keller. After 80 years, the mountains had finally given him back. The recovery team moved slowly, roped together, boots crunching over unstable snowpack that hissed and sighed beneath every step. The sun was sharp overhead, bouncing off wet stone and melting ice, turning every ridge into a trap. They had less than a week before the weather turned again, less before the site became too dangerous to access. What the hikers had stumbled upon wasn't just another crash, it was a perfectly preserved moment in history, sealed in a glacial vault and now bleeding into the modern world. The fuselage was half embedded in the slope, crushed nose first into a granite outcrop. The impact had torn the tail section off and warped the wings, but the cockpit remained sealed, shattered glass still clinging to the frame, twisted steel warped by cold and time. The aircraft's skin bore faded paint, and the Luftwaffe cross, the edges almost erased by decades of abrasion. A thin layer of hoarfrost still clung to the metal, evaporating under the sun like breath. When the canopy was finally pried open, silence fell across the team. Inside sat the pilot. Still strapped in, head slumped slightly forward, bones held together by scraps of preserved fabric. The flight suit, German issue from the 1940 seconds, was stiff and darkened, the insignia worn but visible. His gloves were intact, fingers curled, boots still on. The oxygen hose was broken, draped loosely across his chest like a discarded lifeline. The cold had preserved everything unnaturally well, even the canvas straps of the harness. This wasn't a crash site, it was a coffin. Beside the pilot's right hip, nestled against the edge of the seat, lay a rusted pistol, a Luger P8, standard Luftwaffe issue. No signs it had been fired. Just there, holstered then dislodged, waiting with him through the seasons. There was no indication he'd tried to escape, no broken glass from the inside, no effort to crawl free. Whatever killed Hans Keller happened fast impact maybe. Or exposure, sealed into a wreck no one knew to look for. The ice had buried him within days, and then time simply forgot. The recovery crew marked the coordinates, secured the site, and radioed their report down the mountain. One of them whispered, almost to himself, he never left the war. 80 years later, Hans Keller was finally coming home. The forensics team arrived within hours, flown in by helicopter and lowered onto the ridge by harness. Every movement was cautious, measured. Not just because of the terrain, but because of what they were handling. This wasn't just an aircraft. It was a frozen time capsule, a personal history sealed in ice. The crash had taken place in another century, another world, but here it was, real and intact. Inside the pilot's jacket, they found a thin leather pouch. Inside that, folded neatly and pressed flat by time, were 2 black and white photographs. One showed a woman standing by a train platform, half smiling through the blur of old film. The second showed a child, perhaps 4 years old, sitting in a field with a toy airplane. The edges of both images were curled with age, but the faces remained. Someone had waited for him. Someone had never gotten an answer. The cockpit yielded more clues. a compass frozen mid-swing, a torn map of the Alps, a small metal cigarette case engraved with initials H.K. The dog tags were still legible despite corrosion, etched in that unmistakable wartime script, Hans Keller, Lieutenant, Luftwaffe. No rank embellishments, no flair. Just a name and a silence that had lasted 8 decades. The Messerschmitt serial number was run through military archives. Within days, the match was confirmed. A Bf 109 registered out of a southern German airfield, recorded as lost on the 12th of April 1945. Final note in the file: no contact, no wreckage, presumed MIA. It had taken 80 years for that assumption to become truth. DNA samples were carefully extracted from bone fragments preserved beneath the collarbone. Within 2 weeks, cross-referenced with genealogical records from Bavaria, the results came back. A 99.9% match to a living grandnephew of Hans Keller, a man who had never known his great-uncle existed, much less that he had vanished into a glacier at the end of the war. The announcement was made quietly. No press conference, no ceremony. Just a line in a report. Subject positively identified as Lieutenant Hans Keller, Luftwaffe. Missing since April 1945. The cold had held him, the ice had hidden him. But now, history had a name again, and a face to remember. April 1945. The air was thick with defeat, but the war still raged on. In Berlin, Hitler's voice crackled through the walls of the Führerbunker, delusional and defiant, surrounded by the final remnants of his inner circle. Outside, the Allies were closing in on all fronts. Soviet forces had encircled the city from the east, while the Allies stormed north from the west. The last battles were being fought in the streets of a dying Reich, and yet, in the distant skies over southern Germany, pilots like Hans Keller were still being ordered to fly. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable force, was a shadow of itself, its planes damaged, its pilots exhausted, its leadership in disarray. Fuel shortages were crippling, and morale had long since collapsed. The German Air Force, now fighting a war of attrition, scrambled to maintain some semblance of order amidst the chaos. For Hans Keller, a 2-3-year-old lieutenant, the war had become something far darker than duty. He had seen cities burn, comrades fall, and the wreckage of a nation spiraling into ruin. But like so many others, he had no choice but to keep flying. Hans's final mission, launched from a small, barely functioning airfield in southern Germany, was part of the last desperate attempts by the Luftwaffe to maintain some control over the skies. But there was something different about this flight. It wasn't simply a defensive patrol or an attack on advancing Allied forces. The mission was shrouded in secrecy, classified, with no explanation given. What was he really flying toward? Scouting enemy positions? Gathering intelligence from the rapidly crumbling fronts? Or perhaps it was a chance to escape, to flee the inevitable collapse and the wrath of the approaching Allies. There were rumors of high-ranking officials and soldiers retreating, hoping to reach neutral Switzerland or Italy, escaping to the south where they might avoid capture or worse. The final days of the war were filled with such desperate flights. Record after record in the Luftwaffe archives tells of pilots sent on reconnaissance or special missions, their destinations vague, their chances of return slim. Some were sent to relay intelligence, others to act as decoys, and a few, like Hans, may have flown under orders to simply disappear, trying to save themselves, or perhaps to buy the Reich more time. The further south Hans flew, the more uncertain his future became, and the more fractured the war's command. What would his mission have been? To report on enemy movements? To relay critical documents or technology? Or perhaps the mission was not an order at all, but a final, desperate escape from the collapse of everything he had known. After the wreckage was carefully examined, a small leather notebook was found tucked into one of the pilot's pockets. It was weathered, The edges curled and frayed, but the ink inside was legible in parts. The pages, once neat and meticulous, were now smudged and stained as if they had been handled in haste during those final hours. The notebook was a glimpse into Hans Keller's mind as he flew, trapped between duty and despair. On the first few pages were standard flight calculations, fuel estimates, altitude readings, coordinates. Nothing unusual, but as the pages turned, the writing began to change. The tone became more fragmented, more desperate. The notes reflected his increasing uncertainty, his awareness that the war was slipping beyond any hope of recovery. One line stood out, written just days before the flight that would end in the mountains. "We're losing everything. I can't go back." The words were a stark admission of the internal collapse Hans had witnessed. The entry was like a confession, raw and unfiltered. It was as if, in those last moments, Hans had realized that no matter what he did, there was no escape from the destruction that surrounded him. Other parts of the journal contained brief observations about the mission, but they were increasingly cryptic. "The map is wrong. Too many mistakes. Can't trust the routes." And, "I am flying blind, just like the rest of us." These notes were scattered, disconnected like pieces of a puzzle that had no answer. Was Hans doubting the mission he had been given? Was he questioning his place in a war that had long since turned against him? At one point the handwriting stopped altogether, replaced by a scrawled, hurried line. "What happens if we don't come back?" The words were striking in their simplicity. A young man, once filled with purpose and pride, now reduced to questioning his very existence in the face of a war that had no clear end. The journal, though incomplete, revealed more than just a series of flight logs. It was a personal chronicle of a man coming to terms with the end of his world and the weight of the decisions that lay in his final moments. The flight Hans Keller took that day was not just a mission, it was his last, a journey marked by the fading hope of escape and the finality of surrender. When news of the wreckage spread, it wasn't just military historians who paid attention, it was scientists too. Glaciologists arrived at the site days after the recovery team, armed with equipment, drones, and decades of data. They weren't there to study the plane, they were there to study what had buried it. The aircraft hadn't simply crashed and stayed visible. It had vanished beneath the ice, hidden not by camouflage or remoteness, but by nature itself. According to satellite analysis and glacier records, the ice field where Hans Keller's Messerschmitt was found had grown rapidly in the years following World War II. The 1,950 seconds brought colder winters and consistent snowfall across the Alps. As layers accumulated, older debris was compacted, forced downward into ice that moved like stone on a slow, grinding conveyor. By the early 1,960 seconds, the wreckage was likely entombed 30 meters beneath the surface, deep enough to vanish from even the most hopeful search. And then the process reversed. The last 2 decades saw warming temperatures and record-breaking summer melts across Europe. Glaciers that had been growing for centuries began to retreat faster than anyone had predicted. What took 80 years to hide, the climate revealed in a matter of weeks. Meltwater carved new channels into ancient ice, exposing fragments of rock, bone, and twisted metal. The Messerschmitt hadn't reappeared because someone found it. It reappeared because the Earth had finally let it go. At the crash site, the glaciologists pointed out telltale signs: melt lines running down the slope, ancient snowfields collapsing into crevices. The plane had likely been just beneath the surface for years, inches away from discovery. If that hiker had passed through here even 5 summers ago, one scientist said, they would have walked right over him. The glacier wasn't just a natural phenomenon, it had become a vault, storing history in perfect cold silence. A vault that was now, year by year, unlocking itself. Hans Keller's story might be the first to surface, but it likely won't be the last. The Alps are melting, and the past is coming with them. Long before Hans Keller's wreckage was found, the mountains whispered stories about pilots who never came home. In the remote alpine villages that dotted the Austrian-Italian border, there were always tales of aircraft that vanished into storms, of engines heard echoing across the peaks at night, of lights glimpsed just above the tree line before disappearing into clouds. Most dismissed them as legends, the kind of stories told in ski lodges and mountain huts, when the power flickered and the wind howled outside. But the rumors persisted. In the 1,960 seconds, a shepherd claimed he saw the glint of metal buried in a glacier far above his pasture. He described it as a silver wing poking from the snow, but when locals hiked up weeks later, they found nothing. In the 1,980 seconds, a pair of climbers bivouacking near the same ridge swore they heard an aircraft engine pass overhead, slow, low, impossibly close, though no radar contact was ever confirmed. When they reported it to authorities, they were told what people always are: altitude sickness, hallucinations, overactive imagination. But both men were experienced, and both stuck to their story. Even the older generation had memories. One woman, now in her 90 seconds, recalled how her father once spoke of a missing German pilot during the war. He said the man flew over the peaks and disappeared into the snow, she said. They searched, but the mountains swallowed him. No one could confirm the account. There were no reports, no official statements, just fragments of memory passed down like warnings. Don't trust the quiet. The mountain keeps things. For decades, the idea of a pilot frozen in time seemed more ghost story than fact. The Alps had become a graveyard of the forgotten, and Hans Keller was just one of many names lost to the snow. But now, with his discovery, the legends feel different, validated, real. The hikers who found the wreckage said they didn't feel alone on that slope. They spoke of a strange stillness, like the mountain was holding its breath. Maybe the old stories weren't just tales. Maybe the ghosts of the Alps were never ghosts at all, just men like Hans, waiting to be found. When the name Hans Keller re-entered the world in 2025, it did so quietly. There were no long-lost children, no wife who had waited. Hans had left behind only a fragment of a family's scattered descendants who had grown up hearing his name more as a shadow than a person. Reporters tracked down a niece in Bavaria, now in her 80 seconds, who sat in a quiet apartment surrounded by fading photo albums and old porcelain. When asked if she remembered him, she smiled faintly and said, "Hans was the golden boy," but he vanished like smoke. To her, he was the uncle who smiled in pictures but never came home. She recalled stories her mother used to tell, how Hans loved model planes, how he built balsa wood gliders as a boy and left them dangling from tree branches in the orchard. He was bright, she said. Too bright for war. She paused, then added, he wrote letters during the first year. Then they stopped. My mother cried every morning for months. Military records confirmed what the family remembered. Hans Keller had enlisted at 19, graduated top of his flight school class, and was quickly promoted. He wasn't reckless, he was precise, disciplined, even admired. But the reports began to shift in tone after 1943. Noted fatigue, changes in behavior, requests for leave. A superior wrote that Keller was efficient but withdrawn, clearly affected by combat exposure. By 1944, he was still flying, but something had changed. His flight logs became less detailed, his handwriting more rushed. One record, declassified decades later, listed him as part of a special reconnaissance wing tasked with classified southern operations. The file was mostly redacted, but the dates matched his last recorded mission. Even as Germany burned, Hans was still being sent up, still flying through dying airspace for a war that no longer believed in itself. What haunted the relatives most wasn't how he died, but how little anyone seemed to know about who he had become. He was just gone, the niece said. One day, we stopped talking about him. It was too painful. Now, with his story returning to the light, the family has begun to remember again. Not the soldier, but the boy who vanished into the clouds. The official report listed Hans Keller's final flight as reconnaissance. But 80 years later, that word raises more questions than it answers. What was there to observe in April 1945? The Allies were days from tearing through southern Germany. The war was ending in fire and surrender. Entire squadrons were grounded for lack of fuel. Pilots were being captured or shot down daily. And yet Hans was still flying alone toward the Alps on a mission with no clear return. Speculation spread quickly after the discovery. Historians and journalists traced fragments of wartime records matching airfield logs, aircraft serials, radio intercepts. What emerged was a maze of theories. Some believed Hans had been tasked with transporting sensitive intelligence documents, maps, or even names of high-ranking officers attempting to negotiate surrender. Others suggested he had been carrying something far more valuable: Reichsbank gold, stolen art, or prototypes of Nazi technology meant to be delivered to sympathetic contacts across the border. One theory stood out. In the last months of the war, the Luftwaffe had begun issuing what they called discretionary flight plans, essentially blank orders allowing select pilots to fly without oversight. Officially, these were meant for rapid reconnaissance. Unofficially, they were escape routes. Maps recovered from other wrecks showed marked paths into neutral Switzerland and even northern Italy, where sympathetic enclaves still existed. A final exit strategy for men who knew the war was over but feared what surrender would bring. Was Hans fleeing? Was he ordered to? Or was he one of many who saw the writing on the wall and chose exile over capture? Inside the cockpit, no documents were recovered. If he was carrying anything secret, it either burned in the crash or vanished into the glacier. But the strange trajectory of his flight, the secrecy surrounding his orders, and the absence of any standard mission debrief all point to something more than routine. This wasn't just another patrol. It was something else, something buried, not just in ice, but in deliberate silence. Whatever the mission had been, Hans took its purpose with him into the mountain, and for 80 years, the mountain kept its mouth shut. The final crash analysis offered few certainties, just possibilities, stitched together from fragments of metal, torn canvas, and the silent position of bones. The slope where Hans Keller's Messerschmitt was found bore no deep impact crater, no burn marks, no signs of fire. The aircraft hadn't exploded. It had struck the mountain hard, fast, and clean nose first into rock, crumpling like paper under its own weight. The experts believe it happened in seconds, maybe even less. One moment Hans was flying through the thin air above the Alps. The next, it was over. Reconstruction suggested the plane encountered a sudden downdraft, a deadly alpine phenomenon that could pull a fighter jet from the sky in seconds. Coupled with thick cloud cover and low visibility, it would have been impossible to navigate. Perhaps he thought he had more altitude. Perhaps he didn't see the ridgeline rising ahead until it was already too late. Some theorized mechanical failure. Others pointed to fuel starvation. But none of it changed the outcome. He didn't eject. He didn't call for help. No distress signal. No flares. The crash was immediate and final. Inside the cockpit, his position told the story. Seatbelt still fastened, head tilted forward, no signs of struggle, no desperate claw marks or broken bones suggesting survival. Death, when it came, was likely instantaneous. No pain, no time to fear it, just silence, and then cold. The glacier moved in slowly. Over the course of weeks, snow drifted in through broken glass, then ice, then pressure. The mountain closed around the wreck, sealing it in a frozen vault high above the valleys below. Seasons changed, decades passed. Down in the world, cities rose and fell, wars ended and began. But Hans Keller remained suspended in stillness. His body, his uniform, even the leather around his Luger preserved in ice so cold and dry it had slowed time itself. He became part of the mountain, part of the weather. a soldier caught between earth and sky. For 80 years, no one knew he was there. No one heard the crash, no one found the grave. But now, the glacier has melted just enough to whisper his name again. Hans Keller, Luftwaffe, 1945. Found. At last. The ceremony wasn't large, but it was enough. A narrow clearing in a quiet alpine town, flanked by pine trees and distant peaks. No television crews, no speeches for the cameras, just a folded flag, a casket no longer empty, and the sound of footsteps on gravel as family and officials gathered under a gray sky. Hans Keller was coming home. The Bundeswehr sent a small honor guard. No rifles, just presence. Respect. One officer read aloud from Keller's recovered military file a list of accomplishments, ranks, dates, but it was the final line that carried weight. Vermisst seit April 1945, gefunden 2025. Missing since April 1945, found 2025. It didn't seem possible, and yet here he was, laid to rest in earth that hadn't known his name when he disappeared. The elderly niece from Bavaria stood beside the grave. She placed a small photo on the coffin. Hans, at age 12, smiling beside a balsa glider he'd built himself. "He was always reaching for the sky," she whispered. Her voice cracked, not from grief, but relief. "Now he can rest." The local priest spoke briefly, offering words not of redemption, but of closure. Some wars end in gunfire, others end in silence. This one ended in ice. And now, with warmth. The casket was lowered as alpine bells rang in the distance, their sound drifting across the valley like memory itself. For decades, Hans had been a ghost, a name on a faded document, a face in a family story that no one finished telling. But now he had a grave, coordinates, a stone, an ending. Soldiers like him had once filled the skies above Europe, many of them lost forever. But this one came back. Or rather, the mountain gave him back. As the ceremony ended, a cold wind swept down from the ridge where the Messerschmitt had rested for so long. A reminder that the past is never truly gone. It waits, patient, beneath snow and silence, until someone listens. And this time, someone did. After 80 years, Hans Keller is no longer missing. He's home. The Alps do not speak, but they remember. Their peaks rise with ancient stillness, their valleys carved by time and silence. In war, they were boundary and refuge, battlefield and grave. And when the world turned away, when battles ended and stories were forgotten, the mountains kept what no one else could wreckage, remains, fragments of names. Hans Keller was not the only one. He will not be the last. Across the ridgelines of Europe, thousands remain missing. Allied bombers that vanished without a signal. German fighters that never returned. Soldiers lost on foot, swallowed by avalanches, storms, or darkness. Even today, hikers find bones beneath melting ice, metal beneath moss, journals sealed in rusted tins. Each discovery is a life returned. Each one begins as a question: who was this? Where did they go? Why did no one come? The answers, when they come at all, come slowly. Through weathered dog tags, faded photographs, aircraft IDs matched to forgotten files. Time erases, but the cold resists. The glaciers preserve what memory forgets. Hans Keller flew into a sky filled with war and uncertainty. He vanished without witnesses, without wreckage, without a sound loud enough to carry back down into the valleys. For decades his story was incomplete, a page torn from history, never turned until the summer of melt, until the hikers came, until the glacier, shifting like breath, opened its grip and offered up a piece of the past, not whole, not triumphant, but true. The truth is this: the mountains do not forget. They bury, they hold, and sometimes they give back. Hans's story is now complete, but the Alps still keep many others. Stories of pilots and prisoners, refugees and runners, victories and tragedies, all locked in frost and stone. And as the climate changes, as the ice retreats, more stories will surface, some joyful, most not, but all waiting. Because not all ghosts haunt, some simply wait to be found. Some stories end in silence, others wait 80 years to be heard. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.